You're listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. Fresh Hell contains stories of a disturbing and often graphic nature and is intended for a mature audience. Please don't let your kids listen to this, or they might turn out like us. Hi, I'm Annie from the US, and you're listening to Fresh Hell, your favorite international podcast. I'm really sorry to say that today it's just me. Johanna has had a last-minute sort of family emergency. Everyone's fine. No one's sick or injured. It's the stranded loved one who needs a ride kind of a situation. Everyone's fine, and she will be back next week. I wish she was here because it's been Migraine City for the past 2 weeks, so I really hope this makes sense to everybody. I've been thinking for a while that I'd really love to do a series of cases from different towns on Cape Cod. I guess episode 1 I've already done. That would probably have been my initial coverage on the mystery of the Lady of the Dunes in Provincetown, who we now know is Ruth Terry. But this episode today is going to be about a murder that took place in Brewster. I first found this case when I read an article on the Brewster Conservationtrust.org website. I will obviously link to it. Paul Gasek, Gasek, is who wrote that. And of course it got me hooked, so thank you very much for that, Paul. There were also many articles from the time, primarily in the Boston Globe, as well as a few others. Those will be listed in sources. I accessed those through newspapers.com, and then, of course, Ancestry to keep track of everyone, and then I'll let you know various other sources as we go. All right, so we're going to start by talking about some Cape Cod history first. Let's jump into it and go way back. So this bit of information, the history, is from capecod.com, also an article from wickedlocal.com by Virginia Laporte. That was in August 2008, and the name of that article was Nauset, Cape Cod's Native Americans. There's also a YouTube video about life before the Pilgrims arrived. That's part of the 1620 project. So the native inhabitants prior to colonization of this area were the Wampanoag or Wampanoag people. Wampanoag meant people of the light, as their territory extended all the way to the end of Cape Cod, the easternmost point, the first place to see the sun, right? So they're the people of the light. And for at least 100 years before the Mayflower landed on the Cape and then Plymouth, various Europeans had interaction with the native Cape Codders. And it was generally to the detriment of the local tribes. Wave after wave of plagues, which were, of course, exposure to European diseases like smallpox, measles, influenza, actual plague, Yersinia pestis. They had no protection from any of these illnesses, and it just meant absolute decimation of their people, with an estimated 90 to 95% dying of communicable disease. So there was a really interesting article I found, and it's called A Historical Perspective of Healthcare Disparity and Infectious Disease in the Native American Population. It was published by Dr. Jamie E. Ehrenpreis, Ehrenpreis. Dr. Jamie E. Ehrenpreis, M.D., and Eli D. Ehrenpreis, M.D. And so their article says, quote, "During the initial phase of European colonization, infectious diseases were the primary killer among Native American communities. Infections ranging from smallpox, bubonic plague, chickenpox, cholera, the common cold, influenza, malaria, measles, scarlet fever, typhoid, tuberculosis, leptospirosis, and pertussis produced illnesses and extensive death. It is estimated that 95% of the indigenous populations in the Americas were killed by infectious diseases during the years following European colonization, amounting to an estimated 20 million people. While Europeans coming to the New World had herd immunity or were asymptomatic carriers of many of these diseases, Native American populations who were being exposed to pathogens for the first time experienced deadly epidemics. This has been termed, quote, the virgin soil effect. Although some of these infections were already present in the New World, including tuberculosis and leptospirosis, when settlers arrived, a lack of food, violent conflict, and changing environment enhanced the virulence of these organisms. The spread of these diseases was intensified by the practice of capturing and selling Native American slaves along trade routes and the forced concentration of Native Americans into specific areas. For example, it is believed that the dengue fever became endemic in the United States after introduction from the slave trade. Social conditions experienced by the Native American population, including starvation due to loss of land and lack of access to hunting and trading routes, lack of clean water, the destruction caused by warfare, are hypothesized to have perpetuated the severity of infectious epidemics among Native American populations. End quote. So there were also positive interactions on both sides, obviously. I don't think anyone questions that the Native Americans helped the Pilgrims to survive. They certainly would not have done so without their assistance, and many people had very positive relations with the locals, so to speak. I also read, and that makes perfect sense, that current Route 6A, so current Route 6A is the really scenic road, the 2-lane, 1 lane in each direction, and that's the road that there was before the main highway. And so I was just reading that 6A isn't just built on old cart path, which were, because that's what we always think, right? Especially in Boston. All of our streets are wonky. They're all one-way streets in the wrong direction. They're all built from these crazy, crazy cart paths, horse and buggy paths. Whereas New York was like a planned city. So it's a perfect grid that really makes sense. But here it's really not. And what I hadn't realized, or maybe I'm sure I must have heard this at some point and forgotten, is that, of course, the horse and buggy carts that formed the original 6A, they were following Wampanoag trails, right, that had become cart paths. Then east of the Bass River, so that includes Brewster, Orleans, Wellfleet, Truro, Provincetown, you also had the Nauset tribe, and they were their own distinct group that they also, though, abided by the rules of the nearby Wampanoag. Today, the Nauset tribe is completely gone. I would love it if I'm wrong about that, but I believe they are no more. It's only through marriage with Wampanoag members and white settlers or various immigrant settlers that the Nauset people still live on. Of course, people local to Cape Cod or people who have visited Cape Cod will recognize the name Nauset. It's the name of the high school for most of those schools, actually. I'll go to Nauset. Nauset Light is quite famous. Nauset Beach is where the big waves are. And if you'd like to learn more about Native people on Cape Cod, I would very much recommend that when you visit Cape Cod, you go to the Cape Cod National Seashore in Eastham and see their exhibits. Also visit Fort Hill in Eastham, especially if you like to go for it's not a hike, it's a walk. And it's a beautiful walk. And the last suggestion is the museum at the base of the Pilgrim Monument in Provincetown. Those are 3 quick places I can think of to really get a little bit more information on pre-colonial Cape Cod. All of them have great exhibits about how the people lived, how they kept the pilgrims alive. It's good. Also, check out what used to be called Plymouth Plantation. It's now known as the Plymouth Patuxet Museums. They have very educational working living exhibits where you can go and speak to members of the Wampanoag tribe. You can ask them questions. They give demonstrations on all kinds of things. And it's really, really fascinating and very educational. Okay. Now we're moving forward, and we're going to skip right on ahead to the 1870s. Cape Cod is a sea captain's paradise for obvious reasons. It's said that back in the day, like way back in the day, you could just walk out at low tide and pick up lobsters. Just pick them right up. Hundreds and hundreds of lobsters as soon as the tide went out. I've never seen a lobster at low tide. And of course, they said that there were so many cod in the area, in the sea, that you could walk on their backs from one end of Cape Cod to the other, just across the ocean on codfish backs. Yeah, that's how Cape Cod came to be known by Cape Cod. And this is all way before we had a canal, right? So Sandwich, Massachusetts, which is where I went to junior and senior high school, that was the first town on Cape Cod to be settled, and it was settled in 1637. Brewster, which I consider to be my other hometown, was settled in 1653. It had originally been part of the town of Harwich. In the UK, you'd say Harwich, but it's a hard R for people who don't usually pronounce their R's. We say Harwich or Hawich. And so Brewster was part of Hawich until 1803, and then it split off and became its own town. So the north, the bay side is Brewster, and the southern ocean side is Harwich. This is really common around here. I don't know if it happens in Austria, but around here it's really common for there to be a town, and then as it gets bigger and bigger, it'll split in half and form two towns and build another town hall and another church just to support the number of people it needs to support, another school, all that fun stuff. Brewster is 85 miles or 137 kilometers southeast of Boston, and in 1890 there were approximately 1,000 residents. Brewster is also a popular spot, as is all of Cape Cod, for growing cranberries. The way the cranberries grow is a constant source of surprise to people who come to visit me on Cape Cod. Have we already talked about this? Do you know what I'm talking about? Apologies if I've already told you all this, but my experience has shown me that people generally speaking, one of two things when it comes to how cranberries are. One is that they grow on shrubs like a blueberry, and you pick them off a shrub. The other is that they grow more like a cherry, and they're picked off a tree, the way cherries or, I guess, apples would be. How they actually grow is in bogs. Cape Cod was carved by glaciers, and giant chunks of ice that broke off the main glacier would sort of settle and become kettle ponds. These freshwater ponds are all over the Cape. In fact, Cliff Pond and Nickerson State Park in Brewster is the deepest on Cape Cod. It is 88 feet deep. I'm not sure how many meters that is. It's deep. There's a great video about this at the National Seashore, and I swear it's at least from the 80s, and I'll share the link to you on YouTube. It's one of those, it's so grainy, and it's got like synth pop music, and it's like, look at the sands of time. Watch how a beach changes. It's kind of fascinating, but yeah, if you've been there before, it'll take you straight back to childhood on Cape Cod. All of these glacial deposits made a perfect boggy wetland growing area for the North American cranberry. And the original inhabitants of the area, including, as we mentioned before, the Wampanoag and Nauset, they had been using cranberries for ages. They were regularly used as part of medicine. They were dried along with meat like deer meat, and they made pemmican out of it for traveling food and storing food for the winter. And they introduced the Pilgrims to cranberries, and the Pilgrims were more familiar with the versions that they have. I think in Europe there's another kind of cranberry, but I don't think it's as nice. So cranberry cultivation really started in 1816 when Captain Henry Hall, a Revolutionary War veteran who was living in Dennis, noticed that the wild cranberries that grew in the bogs on his property grew a lot better when sand had been blown over them. And so Captain Hall began to sort of experiment with his cranberries. He transplanted some of them. He spread sand on them. His actions are what started a sort of cranberry boom. Initially, the idea of growing and selling cranberries commercially was sort of laughed at. But it soon caught on, and landowners on Cape Cod and in southeastern Massachusetts, so Plymouth County area, they were all quickly converting swamps, wetlands, peat bogs. All the swampy areas were being converted into cranberry bogs, where these little low-lying vines grow. This is a quote from cranberries.org, which is where I found most of this information on cranberries. It says, quote, by 1885, Plymouth County, so that's Plymouth, Massachusetts area, boasted 1,347 acres of cultivation. Barnstable County, that's the Cape, had 2,408. By 1900, so 15 years later, 15, the number of acres tripled, making Cape Cod a household name. Cranberry fever struck in the industry, and the industry boomed as late as 1927. The cranberry harvest remains so vital to local and state economies that Massachusetts children would be excused from school to work the bogs during harvest season. End quote. So it goes on to talk about the history of cranberries and how scoops and sorting changed things. It says, quote, in the 1880s, wooden cranberry scoops started to replace traditional hand picking. Sorters and screening equipment soon followed. Expansion also meant new workers on the bogs. Although many growers still relied on traditional family and community support during the harvest, demands for higher wages provided opportunities for newly arrived immigrants from Finland and the Cape Verdean Islands, seeking better economic opportunities and the chance at an improved life. End quote. If you visit the Brewster General Store, which is one of my favorite haunts, and a building that was around and thriving and very near the location of today's story, I mean, very near. I think witnesses to the murder might have been at the store. They have, I think it's upstairs. I think upstairs they have an antique cranberry sorter, and you can go and take a look and see what it looks like. It's pretty interesting. They also have like properly roasted peanuts and really good fudge, especially panucci, which is a New England favorite, my favorite. I love the Brewster store. Check out their cranberry thing. That's what I was talking about. What else? Oh, cranberry bogs. They're also flooded in the off-season in order to sort of insulate and protect the plants from the very cold winters. So the Moose and I, like a lot of Cape Cod kids, grew up skating on cranberry bogs, which is very, very common. Some kids play street hockey. On Cape Cod, we play ice hockey on cranberry bogs. When I graduated from high school on Cape Cod in 1995, we did not have a football team, but we had a pretty kick-ass hockey team. I know nothing about hockey. The cranberry harvesting happens every fall, and it's beautiful because the trees have turned and they flood the bogs, and then they have beaters that knock the berries off so they float up. Then they're collected, and so you have these bright red berries floating on these pond surfaces with the bright, beautiful trees. It's gorgeous, 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 gorgeous. So it was really hard work, though, back in the day before all of these different innovations were made. And that's how it would have been during the time that we're discussing today. Cape Cod is not the #1 producer of cranberries in the United States. It's actually Wisconsin. That doesn't seem right. You guys have cheese. A few more fun facts about the town of Brewster before we get started, just to paint more of a picture of what was there at the end of the 1800s when our murder takes place. So the town's grist mill had been built sometime after 1653, and it ground corn for both the white settlers as well as the Native American inhabitants of the land. So that's nice. It's located near the Herring Run. And where the grist mill is in the 1700s was a factory row with mills there in that area, and it was a really, really popular area. Today, the town grist mill is still there, and you can visit it. And then across the street is the Herring Run, which is a fish ladder on Stony Brook Road, right opposite the grist mill. And it's where the herring swim upstream into Cape Cod ponds and lakes to spawn. When I was a kid in the 80s, you could go with nets. I feel like we used to do this around Easter, usually, and you could go with nets. And it was one of my favorite things to do because it's basically, if you can imagine, a bunch of steps, like big concrete steps, and every step is a little koi pond. This isn't exactly like it is, but if you've never seen a fish ladder. And then they have to leap from one to the next one. And they're built like this to help the fish get to where they need to go so they don't get washed all the way back to where they started. And so we would go with our special nets and we'd scoop out a couple of herring and then run as fast as we could up a couple of steps up the ladder and then let it go so it wasn't out of the water too long. You'd also run around and grab the ones that had accidentally thrown themselves out of the water accidentally and knock them back into the water. So I used to love that. You aren't allowed to touch the fish anymore, which is probably for everyone's best interests. It's worth checking out if you're on the Cape in the spring. It really is, though, honestly. If you are looking to not touch some fish and probably get shat on by a seagull, go check out the herring run. It doesn't sound as like I love it as much as I do, but I really do. Also, be sure to check your speed on that portion of road on Stony Brook near the herring run because there are a lot of pedestrians who cross the street there. There's kind of a curve in the road. The speed limit drops quite a bit right there, and there are often police. So just take your time, slow down. The name Brewster comes from Elder Brewster, who was the religious leader on the Mayflower. Here are some more facts about Brewster. This is all from the Captain Freeman Inn website. Brewster is very much known for its gorgeous sea captain homes, but all of Cape Cod is kind of known for their sea captain's homes. They're beautiful. Many of them today are these really beautiful inns, and I have never stayed in any of them. But yeah, the Captain Freeman house was there when all of this happened. So then I have a note that talks about the flats. Those are our Brewster tidal flats, and it measures approximately 12,000 acres at low tide, and they are the largest flats in North America. You can walk a mile straight out onto the ocean seafloor if there's nothing, without getting your shins wet, as long as you time the tide right, which is crucial. So the Captain Freeman Inn is saying that if you hike out into the middle of the bay, you can see where the original wooden packet landing was built to allow packet ships to come to Breakwater Landing, where they ferried cargo and travelers to and from Boston. I never knew that. Okay, so it says the Brewster Ladies Library was established in 1852, and the current building was completed in 1868. It's gorgeous. I spent many a happy rainy day in my youth checking out and reading Nancy Drew books in that library. It says by 1809, 60,000 feet of salt works lined our shore. The salt works industry reached its peak in the 1830s. The salt works provided such a huge value in the early 1800s, I thought this was really interesting, that during the War of 1812, a British naval commander threatened to blow up the salt works unless the town paid a $4,000 bribe. And it was paid. That's wild, right? Our Brewster General Store has operated as a general store since 1858. It was originally a Universalist church that was built in 1852, and then it was sold to W.W. Knowles, who converted it into a general store. It's still a general store today, and I've mentioned it already, but it's a general store at the time of our episode. By the mid-1800s, railroads were being built across America. The first steam engine chugged into Brewster in 1865, right when the Captain Freeman Inn was being built. The 17th century Cape Cod economy was mainly agricultural, but by the 18th century shifted to maritime, with the main ports in Brewster being Saints Landing and Point of Rocks. By 1850, I thought you'd like this one, Johanna. I saved this one for you. By 1850, the clipper ships, the most expensive and beautiful sailing vessels in the world, supported international commerce. Captain Freeman commanded the famed Kingfisher, the Maine, and the Undaunted. So, pretty cool stuff. I've never been to the Captain Freeman. I've got some other ones I would recommend that are going to come up later, but I've never been to any of them. I've just heard only good things. Okay, now it's time to talk about a terrible, terrible, terrible murder. This is a kind of a brief story because there just aren't that many facts, and it's all kind of matter of fact. We know who, what, where, why, and when, which we don't always have, and this time we do. Now let's talk about the Hassard family. Their name is spelled Hassard. And when I saw that they emigrated from Northern Ireland, I sent a voice message to my friend Colette, who lives in Northern Ireland, and I said, "How do you think this might be pronounced? Is it Hassard? Hassard?" And she agreed. It was probably maybe like Hassard or... But then as I'm going through more and more records, it's changing as I'm reading, census records, newspaper reports, birth records, you name it, and it changes from Hassard to Hazard, Hazzard, with lots of combinations in between. So I think I can safely say it was pronounced Hazard, because I think people back then spelled phonetically, right? A lot of the time with names. We still do. It's why we so often mispronounce names, especially when we're recording. Who knew it would be such a nightmare? So John Hassard, age 21, and Sarah Hicks, age 20, were married in County Cavan, Northern Ireland, on 16th of March, 1868. And in 1869, they emigrated to the U.S. and settled on Cape Cod in the town of Brewster, where John worked on farms. Their first child, a girl they named Mary, was born in 1870. In 1871, their second child, another daughter named Sarah, was born. That's who we're going to be talking about today, primarily. In 1872, their only son, John J. Hassard Jr., was born. There's a lot of J's in there. In 1873, Addie was born, their daughter. In 1876, daughter Florence was born. And in 1880, their youngest, the baby Maud, was born. Great names, all of them. The Hassard family lived on Lower Road near the old cemetery. The first tragedy to befall the family that made the papers was in February of 1890. This is from the Barnstable Patriot, which was a Cape Cod newspaper. Quote, "Narrow escape from drowning. 2 of our young men, Fred Young and John J. Hassard, went in a boat Monday last to get some clams that were left in sacks, when unexpectedly the rope snapped in twain, and Young was thrown overboard by the recoil. In attempting to get into the boat again, Young upset it, and Hassard too was turned into the water, which was cold as ice. The boat was more than a mile from shore, and the men were clad in heavy winter garments, which now grew heavier as the water soaked into them. The attempt to swim could not be made with any chance of safety, and they hung on the overturned boat as their best hope. After more than an hour had passed, in a vain attempt to attract attention, the unfortunates caught sight of William Saint coming out of his mother's house, which is near the shore of the bay. His attention was secured after desperate efforts, and Saint at once began to save the disconsolate. He was obliged to go half a mile after a boat and then row to the wreck. But the helpful youth did all that and managed to bring the castaways to land, nearly exhausted. He had to carry Hassard in his arms, faint and dripping, up the steep bank. How he managed such a heavy load is surprising, but many things are possible to a good-hearted, resolute soul. It is a call worthy of the notice of the Humane Society." End quote. This, of course, probably took place a little bit west and north of the Hassard farm where Saint's Landing is today. And that's terrifying. That's a terrible thing to have to go through. And it's really a miracle that they didn't die of pneumonia or exposure. I mean, really, that could have been so bad. But he survived. However, in the case of John Hassard Jr., there was something of a final destination situation happening. This is from the Fall River Daily Evening News, Wednesday, November 5th, 1890. Quote, Last Wednesday morning, while 3 young men of Brewster were gunning in a boat, John Hassard Jr. was accidentally shot and died Thursday morning. End quote. And that was it. That was really all I could find. So less than a year after he almost died in that clamming accident where he miraculously managed not to drown or die of hypothermia or pneumonia, he's accidentally shot while out in the bay, presumably duck hunting. And he died of his wounds the next day, October 30th. And sadly, this line of the Hassard family name would end with his death. He was 19 years and 22 days old. I think he was probably taken home to his parents' house if it says that he died the next day, right? It's incredibly sad. It's incredibly sad. But life moves on, and 6 months later, their firstborn daughter, Mary, she was married to Elmer Kenny. Sometime after that, their second oldest daughter, Sarah, who everyone calls Sadie, she meets a nice young man at a local meeting. His name is Frederick Smith Alexander, and his family had settled on the Cape for some time. He wasn't first-generation American like Sadie. His family had been around for a long time. On his mother's side, she was an Ellis. There are a lot of names that come up over and over in this episode when I was doing research. Names like Ellis and Cosby and Crosby and, Linnell, Thad Ellis. A lot of these names are going to sound familiar to people who know the area because they're the names of historic buildings and streets in the town. Yeah, Fred seemed like a nice guy. He was 3 years older than Sadie. It looks like he probably worked as a cranberry man. And they first met, there was like some sort of a meeting at the local church, it was like a town meeting hall. So it was like a meeting of young whatevers. It doesn't matter. One of these local town meeting things. So that's where they meet, and he asks if he can walk her home, and he had a younger sister named Celinda and a younger brother named Arthur. I'm not going to get too much more into his family because it's just a really sad chapter and something they don't probably want to be remembered for, whereas I feel like the victim, you want to talk about them a little bit more. Not that his family weren't mourning, but you know what I'm talking about. Okay. Fred and Sadie are walking with each other for some time, but reports really vary exactly on how long they see each other or if they were even seeing each other at all. It's totally possible that he just regularly insisted on walking her home and she didn't really have any say in the matter. Do you know? That is absolutely possible. They might have been courting, or they might have been casual friends, or he just might have been insisting on walking her home. We just don't know. But at some point, Sadie decided that she didn't want to see him anymore. We don't know exactly what happened. Did she only care for him as a friend, and he kept pushing for more in a violent way? Or had they been dating and she saw behavior that made her realize this was not the person she wanted to spend the rest of her life with? And by dating, I mean walking her home because it's the 1800s, so. But we don't know. But we know she wasn't interested in anyone else. She just wanted nothing to do with Fred. And he was not happy about this at all. He had been heard saying that if he couldn't marry her, no one would marry her. He went to her parents' house with a form filled out for the registry showing an intent to marry. So filing the banns, right? So saying, this is my name, these are my parents, I'm going to marry this person who's the child of these people on this day, and here we go. And so he's got all this paperwork with him, and he's ready to fill it out, and he wants her father's blessing to ask for her hand in marriage. And Sadie's father, John, who has survived plenty at this point in his life, says, well, that's really up to my daughter. If she wants you, then I give you my blessing. And so John goes to his daughter and he asks Sadie if she would like to marry Frederick Smith Alexander. And she tells her father that no, she does not want to marry Fred. she does not even want to see Fred again. Her father tells Fred, in no uncertain terms, that his daughter is not interested and to please leave and not come back to the house or to bother his daughter again. And now wouldn't it be nice if that were the end? I mean, really, it would be so nice if she had just said, I would like to stop this relationship, and he said, okay, I totally respect your feelings. I'm sorry to hear it, but I'll see you around. Best of luck. Bye. And then he does that thing where he pretends he's happy when even he's not, just to try to make her jealous. You know, there are things you're supposed to do, and stalking the person is not one of them. It gets worse. Then we have letters, and the letters don't stop, and they're love letters from Fred to Sadie, promising things if she would come back to him, and threatening things if she didn't. So at some point, she had moved out of her family home. It is implied that in one of the articles I read, it's implied that she left the family home and took the job as a housekeeper to get out of the house so that he wouldn't know where she lived. I don't know if that's true. She was also now the oldest daughter at home because her oldest sister had married and started her own family. She might have taken a job and moved out of the home because she was grown, around 1920, in order to make more space in the family home. We don't really know. I know she was still close with her family, but she was working for Reverend Dawes, and Reverend Dawes was the reverend at the Unitarian Church. That's the church on the hill right by the general store. The Unitarian Church was originally the Puritan Church and the center of village life. According to their website, quote, founded in 1700, this was originally a Puritan church and meeting house. It was the law that there be a church within 5 miles walking distance of the homes in any community, and First Parish was it for Harwich. Unitarianism was formalized as a denomination in 1825, and our church was among many Puritan churches that leaned toward the new Unitarian ways of thinking. First Parish became a Unitarian church sometime in the mid-1800s. In 1961, Unitarians and Universalists consolidated into one, and this congregation thus became a Unitarian Universalist community. End quote. I know we have at least one Unitarian minister in our Facebook group, but this is not the church where Sadie's family worshipped. They went to the local Baptist church. It was an offshoot of the traditional Protestant church, Church of England, that they had grown up in. They're Northern Irish and Protestant. The Baptist church is about a 5-minute walk down Main Street, which is also Route 6A, which is also known as the Old Kings Highway. And it is another absolutely beautiful old historic church right next to the very beautiful Ladies' Library. According to their website, quote, in the 1820s, West Harwich Baptist Church ignited a revival on the Lower Cape. Inspired by the movement, a group of Brewster farmers, fishermen, and artisans organized Brewster Baptist Church, at BBC, on December 23, 1824. For the next 3 years, the church met in people's homes and the local schoolhouse. In 1828, the church built their first building, approximately where the church now stands. As membership grew, so did the church. The first edition was built in 1860 and then remodeled in 1881 after a steeple fire. The first parsonage was built in 1874 and a baptistry was added in 1888. End quote. Okay, so these are the two primary churches in our story. There's the Baptist church where Sadie's family attends, and the Unitarian church where her employer, Reverend Dawes, is the pastor. Reverend Dawes was also aware that Fred had shown this unwanted attention to Sadie. Sadie's sisters knew, I think her mother knew, I think everybody knew that Fred had been harassing or really stalking her is what he was doing, but no one told her father that this was going on because everyone was afraid that there would be a ruckus if they told her father, and nobody wanted to create a ruckus. And I wish I could say oh, isn't it a shame how that used to happen? That doesn't still happen, right? But the straw that really became difficult is when he sent her a very threatening letter saying that he was going to kill her. And so she's really afraid now, and she actually sends a letter to his father, Charles. So she writes Charles a letter explaining that she is very much afraid of his son. And that also, can I add, has to be every parent's worst nightmare, right? Well, can I say that has to be every parent's other worst nightmare? I think we think so often about what it must be like to be the parent of a murdered person, like how awful that must be. But I think it also must be awful to be the parent of a murderer. When you've really done everything right, as far as you know, and tried your best and thought you kind of nailed it, and then something like this happens. Yeah. Charles takes this very seriously, and his immediate reaction makes one think that there maybe had been other issues or signs of mental health issues in the past, but who can say? He decides that he's basically going to sit a vigil outside the Reverend Dawes' house in case his son should show up in the night with the intent to hurt Sadie. He's hoping that he'll be there and be able to stop this from happening and be able to intervene. So he sits out all night on May 16th, and there's nothing. It's quiet. There's no sign of Fred anywhere. The next morning is Sunday, May 17th, and Sadie has asked her youngest sister, Maud, to come keep her company because she's feeling afraid to be alone. Reverend Dawes' home is described as being across the street from the church. I assume they mean the Unitarian church, his church. I can't figure out where it is. There's a sketch of it in one of the Boston Globe reports, but I have no idea how accurate it is. I'm going to share the sketch. I keep looking at Google Street View, trying to figure out where this house might have been, and the best I can come up with is maybe it was located where the current Brewster thrift shop is, right across the street from the Universalist Church. I'm wondering if that's maybe where the house was and it didn't survive. It looks really beautiful, but like mansard roof, white picket fence. Can't figure out where this was. So on that morning, it's just Sadie and Maud. Sadie is 25 and Maud is 13 years younger, so she is 12. They're standing in front of the window just to the right of the front door. They're chatting while everyone else is at church. They're just looking out the window, talking. Suddenly, Sarah sees Fred walking toward the house and her heart starts to pound. She can hear Fred banging on the door, but they freeze and they don't move. They don't answer the door. Fred then walks over to the window where she and Maud are standing, frozen, and says, "Won't you just go to the door and let me in? I just want to talk to you." And Sadie says she has no interest in talking to him. She says, "Anything that you need to say, you can say it right now in front of my sister, but I'd really rather you leave." And so Fred shoves the screen in, grabs Sadie by the shoulders, and drags her through the window. Both Sadie and Maud are screaming, and as Maud goes to try to help her sister, Fred pulls a gun and points it directly at Maud, telling her that he does not have any interest in hurting her, but he will shoot her if she follows them. Maud freezes. Sadie is able to wrench herself free from his grip, and she takes off running across the lawn. Just as she gets to the fence gate, Fred catches up to her, pulls him to her, and shoots her in the chest on the right side. She again is able to break away from him, running toward the street, toward the Unitarian church maybe toward her family home, which was on Lobster Lane, which is today known as Lower Road. She's bleeding, she's been shot, and she's running as fast as she can. Fred takes aim and shoots again, firing once, twice. She's still running, but the third shot hits her, and it enters her side below the 11th rib. Sadie falls, screaming in pain, and lands on the sidewalk. Fred keeps on walking to her, and as he reaches her, laying bleeding on the sidewalk, he calmly places the gun behind her ear and shoots her in the head, the bullet severing an artery, causing her to bleed out in moments. Maud and the other witnesses look on in absolute horror because this has all happened so quickly nobody could do anything about it. And as local men begin to advance toward Fred to subdue him, he points a gun at them, and so they stand down and instead turn and run to get Sadie's parents. Her parents, her whole family of course, are completely devastated. In the Daily Boston Globe Morning Edition, Monday, May 18th, 1896, page 1, her father John is quoted as saying, quote, "Reverend Mr. Dawes, with whose family she has lived for a long time, has just been up to see me, and he tells me now, when it is too late, that he knew Alexander was still pursuing her, and had lately threatened her with violence. But none of them told me because they feared I would make such a disturbance, and indeed I would have made it so warm for him that he would have left her in peace, had I known it. Oh, I do so despise such a coward, and to think that my Sadie was murdered in cold blood by such a man as he. Well, it almost unnerves me. I have had a great deal of troubles in my life, and I'm used to bloody scenes. My oldest boy was accidentally shot only a few years ago. I've had 4 uncles shot in England because they would cling to the Protestant religion. One was a minister and was shot on the threshold of his church. Another was a bank cashier and was shot at the door of the bank. Another was shot in his own house, as he was about to light a pipe. But this is the worst blow I have ever experienced because the act was so cowardly, taking the life of my defenseless girl in such a horrible way. My wife is prostrated with grief, and I fear the result of the shock to her nerves, as it brings up so freshly again the terrible moment we passed through when my boy was brought home dead only a few years ago." End quote. So this is, it's just devastating. Fred Alexander takes off to the south, over the hills, and there are some people sort of talking, and they start to put things together. Charles Howland tells everyone there that he was there with Fred's father, Charles, the night before, because Charles had received that letter that Sadie sent him about her being afraid. But he never saw any sign of his son at all. He'd not seen him that day, and he never showed up at the house at night. Now, in the meantime, of course, people had followed Frederick Alexander as he headed south, and the newspapers all report that he was traced back to Snow's Pond. And locals, I could not figure out where Snow's Pond is. I'd never heard of it. It's not on any of the maps. It's not on the local maps of the time that I could find. Best I can figure is maybe it was an old name or a local name for Sheep Pond, because I did find a map from 1880, and on the bank of Sheep Pond is the Snow residence. I know the Snow family were also undertakers, but I'm not totally sure if it's the same Snow or not. But if it was Sheep's Pond, that's only a couple of miles south. It's not a crazy distance away. So wherever this pond was, it's at Snow's Pond, where they arrive, and on the bank they find Fred's hat, and then they also find a loaded gun and a box of cartridges. But there is no sign of Fred, and so they decide to drag the lake. It didn't take long before they found his body. When his body was recovered from the pond, they went through his belongings and found a bottle of strychnine poison, a photograph of himself, a bottle of chloroform that I assume he planned to use on Sadie, a box of matches, and the letter he had written on the day of the murder. A letter I think would haunt his father forever. It was addressed to Reverend Dawes, and it read, quote, "I was right behind your shed all night last night when Father and all the others were searching for me. But I'll kill her today while you are all gone to church, and that will be the last of us both. I won't be taken alive, but if I am cornered, I will make it hot for some of them." End quote. Early reports were that he had shot himself, but it was determined he had actually taken the strychnine poison and then walked into the pond and died where he fell once the poison took hold. Sadie's wounds were examined, and the medical examiner said that any one of them would have been lethal. The first anti-stalking law in the United States was in California about 100 years later, in 1990. This was brought on, in part, due to two murders in particular that will sound very familiar to many people who are well-read on true crime. The first was, of course, the stabbing of actress Teresa Saldana, and then the murder of actress Rebecca Schaefer. So these Hollywood murders had a lot of attention, these stalking cases, and they were able to get legislation passed, and that's, I think, probably to this day why a lot of celebrities choose to live in California. And this law was eventually passed with bipartisan support as the Violence Against Women Act in Congress, which is a start, but I think this case goes to show very clearly that this has been a problem for a very long time. And it's not just for women. This can happen to anyone, and the law protects everyone. But probably still not enough. It's such a serious problem when it happens. And when I first found this case, I said to Johanna, I said, I think this is just it's a pretty straightforward, stereotypical stalking case. And just the fact that I said stereotypical stalking case, this horrible, horrible thing, and it's like, the norm, but also, yeah, it kind of is. There's a lot of jokes. I've seen a lot of jokes lately about, women in true crime, women love true crime, why are women so into true crime? And listen, there are a lot of reasons why people are interested in true crime, not just women. But one of the reasons women in particular may find themselves interested in true crime is because we're so often the victims of true crime. Well, knowledge is power. That is the incredibly, incredibly sad story of the stalking and murder of Miss Sarah Julius Hassard from Brewster, Mass., born and died, who was only 25 years old when she was horribly murdered in front of witnesses, including her little sister, who was only 12. I do have a piece here from the Boston Globe, 21st of May, 1896, Funeral of Sadie Hassard, Brewster. The roads leading to Brewster from all neighboring towns were lined with carriages today, and long before the hour of service, the Baptist church was filled with people coming to attend the funeral of Sadie Hassard, who was foully murdered last Sunday, a short distance from the church. Today, her remains lay in a neat broadcloth casket, which was literally covered with floral offerings from sympathizing relatives and friends. The service was conducted by the pastor, Reverend Mr. Martell, assisted by the aged preacher in whose family Sadie had long lived, Reverend Mr. Dawes, who offered a very fervent prayer for divine aid and benediction upon the sorely wounded hearts. And then it goes on to talk about the pallbearers and what the readings were. The remains of the unfortunate girl were interred in Greenwood Cemetery. The schoolhouse flags were kept at half-mast during the service, indicating the universal sympathy and sorrow throughout the town. There was another small article about how there wasn't going to be a formal service for Frederick, that his body would be going from the undertaker directly to the burial ground with just a brief stop at the family home for a prayer. He is buried in the cemetery on Stony Brook Road, which is maybe 5-10 minutes walk from the grist mill and the herring run. Sadie is in a really beautiful family plot in the old Brewster Cemetery on Lower Road, which is near where her family home was. Several of her close relatives were very long-lived. Her parents and sister Addie all lived into their 90s, and Maud made it to almost 100. She was 99 and change, so I really desperately wish I'd been able to find photographs of anyone, but I had no luck. I found sketches of the houses where things happened, but no sketches of the people. I also really wish I could figure out exactly where this all went down. I'm not joking when I say I spent hours and hours and hours trying to figure this out. And there's probably someone out there who will say, oh yeah, this is exactly where it happened. They're going to know. I'm going to try to visit the graves this fall. I love Cape Cod in the off-season is my favorite time down there. Yeah, and that's my something good, of course, is the beautiful town of Brewster. Johanna, when you come visit, we should see who has the most haunted sea captain home and go stay. I'm sure some of our listeners will have suggestions. There are loads and loads of places, but I don't know. Who's got the best haunted sea captains in on the Cape? Where do I need to go? Meet the local spirits, so to speak. Thanks so much for listening to this story about Sadie Hassard. If you enjoyed today's episode or any of our episodes, please leave us a rating or review when possible. Our email is freshhellpodcast@gmail.com. Our website is freshhellpodcast.com. You'll find links there to our shop as well as to our Patreon. Patreon.com, search Fresh Hell Podcast, and that will give you some information on our tiers. Our next Patreon chat night will be Tuesday, October 29th at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope to see you there. Go check the feed for what we're going to be discussing. Tell your pets we said hi, the dogs, the cats, the donkeys. We love the donkeys. Big shout to all the Hellion donkeys, which is kind of a perfect combination, right? Please remember to give other people the benefit of the doubt and try to be kind to others, and especially to yourself, which is obviously the worst and hardest and most terrible part of being alive. And as Winston Churchill famously said in the middle of World War II, if you're going through hell, keep going. See you next week.